Nolan Wells. He's the 18-year-old whose death during a 4th of July boat trip to a remote Mississippi island is igniting nationwide debate. Jennifer, I want to take a moment to hear what Stephen A. Smith said about this case on Cuomo just a few days ago.
Listen, you're a dad. I'm a dad. We send our children out, and first of all, regardless of what ethnicity, regardless of what color we're talking about here, we send our children out, and you're the only one that doesn't come home alive. I'll be damned if the Chris Cuomo that I know doesn't want answers and doesn't expect answers. You know me, and I'm going to push for answers. So for no one to have answers as to what happens is when the suspicion elevates exponentially.
Seeing the video of Nolan is just so heartbreaking. He seems like such a happy kid. Now, the Daily Mail has identified a 19-year-old young woman who Nolan was last seen speaking to. Now, his friend said he chose to stay behind on Horn Island with that woman. But the woman's sister is claiming that's not true. He was ready to get back on the boat that he came on. Are all these differing accounts and a lack of understanding concerning to you?
Well, I think two things can be true at once. It makes sense that he went off to see about a girl, as they say, and that they had conversation and that he decided to go back and be with friends. So I think it's more of a timing issue rather than something that is untrue on either end. I think both can be true at the same time.
Nolan's death is going to the Mississippi grand jury. The DA said something interesting, that the evidence will not be public until the grand jury reviews it first. The DA says this is to protect the integrity of the investigation and that the grand jury will ultimately decide if someone will be charged. Jennifer, do you believe someone could be charged in his death? Is this just an accident gone terribly wrong?
Well, with what we know, in other words, review of all the surveillance information we have, with actually getting to hear from one of the witnesses, one of his best friends that was there throughout the situation, listening to the calls that were made, the Coast Guard contact, as well as the riptide situation in that area. When you add it all together, what we see publicly seems to be an accident. Having said that, of course, there's going to be information. 60 witnesses interviewed.
Good evening. Tonight, we're examining a case that has divided public opinion, frustrated a grieving family, and left more questions than answers. The death of 18-year-old Nolan Wells on Horn Island, Mississippi, has sparked intense debate, competing theories, and a level of national scrutiny that most cases involving a single contested death never receive. A former FBI agent looked at everything publicly known about Nolan Wells's death and said, "It looks like an accident." Then, almost in the same breath, she said something that undercuts her own conclusion. She doesn't believe what's publicly known is actually the full truth. If you watch this entire story and still don't subscribe, ask yourself what that says about how much you really care about justice, because this isn't just another case. This is a test. A test of whether we still demand answers when the system moves too slowly. A test of whether we're willing to sit with ambiguity until the truth emerges, or whether we'll simply move on to the next headline when this one gets uncomfortable. So which is it? Are his friends telling the truth exactly as they've described it over and over across multiple separate interviews? Or are they lying, coordinating a story to protect themselves from something far worse than a tragic accident? Are they simply afraid? Scared teenagers who made a bad decision after the fact and have been quietly hiding that fear ever since without ever having caused Nolan any harm at all? Or is there something else entirely, something none of us actually knows yet, sitting in that gap between what's been said publicly and what actually happened out on that water? Those aren't rhetorical questions tonight. We're going to answer them as honestly as the evidence currently allows. We're going to lay out every realistic possibility this case actually supports. A clean, tragic accident with nothing hidden. An accident followed by panic and minor concealment. And the more serious possibility some people believe is still on the table. And we're going to address something that's easy to overlook in all the noise around this case. With dozens, maybe hundreds of people on that island that day, nobody has actually confirmed with real certainty what Nolan was doing in the window between the last time he was seen and the moment he ended up in the water. That gap is where every single one of these possibilities actually lives, and it's exactly where we're starting tonight. You're part of this now. You're the jury. You're the witness. And the question you have to ask yourself is this: if Nolan had been someone else, if he'd looked different, if his family had different connections, if the people in power had seen his face and recognized their own, would the investigation have moved faster? Would the answers have come sooner? Jennifer Coffindaffer, a former FBI agent now providing case analysis for News Nation, reviewed the surveillance footage, the witness accounts, the Coast Guard communications, and the well-documented riptide conditions around Horn Island. Her conclusion was direct: when you add it all together, what we see publicly seems to be an accident. That's a real credentialed assessment, not a guess. But she didn't stop there, and the second half of her statement is exactly why this case hasn't settled into a simple closed story. It's worth understanding what actually separates her assessment from most of the commentary this case has generated. She isn't connected to this investigation in any official capacity, and she isn't building a theory from a single viral clip or disputed piece of audio. She's a trained former investigator, working from the same public record everyone else has access to, applying professional judgment to distinguish between details that genuinely support a conclusion and details that simply sound suspicious without actually pointing anywhere specific. That distinction matters enormously in a case that has generated as much competing, unverified content as this one has. I doubt if this what we know will come back with the truth, Coffindaffer said, warning that more details could still emerge. That's not her walking back her own conclusion, it's her being honest about its limits. She's saying the evidence, as it currently exists publicly, points toward an accident. She's also saying separately that she doesn't trust the public record is complete. Both of those statements can be true at once, and holding them together is exactly what this investigation requires. Think about what she's actually describing here. She isn't claiming inside knowledge of this investigation, or suggesting the sheriff's office has told her something the public hasn't heard. She's drawing on something closer to professional pattern recognition. An understanding built over years of real investigative work that cases involving multiple young witnesses, a chaotic scene, and weeks of evolving public statements almost always end up more complicated than whatever version has crystallized in public understanding by this point. That's not a specific accusation against anyone connected to this case. It's simply an acknowledgement that investigations like this one are rarely finished this early, regardless of how confident any single piece of commentary, including her own, might sound in the moment. The world looked away from cases like this for too long. Don't look away now. Every person who subscribes to this channel is a witness, and witnesses are what the dead deserve. I'll say that again. Witnesses are what the dead deserve. Because right now, in Jackson County, Mississippi, the powers that be are hoping this story fades. They're hoping that by the time you finish watching this video, you'll move on to something else, something easier, something that doesn't ask you to care. But we're not going to let that happen. And if you're still watching, neither are you. Before getting into the three possibilities themselves, it's worth grounding this discussion in exactly where the investigation sits right now, since that context shapes how much weight any of these theories can currently carry. Roughly 60 witnesses have been interviewed as investigators work to reconstruct Nolan's final hours on Horn Island. The three friends who were on the boat with him have been formally interviewed. The FBI has assisted with certain aspects of the case, specifically addressing interstate threats made against people connected to the investigation. While the Jackson County Sheriff's Office remains the lead agency throughout, this case is now formally headed toward a Mississippi grand jury, which will ultimately decide whether anyone is charged in connection with Nolan's death. That number, 60 witnesses, deserves real attention on its own. It reflects an investigation that has expanded well beyond the immediate friend group, reaching out to strangers, boaters, and anyone else who might have been present on Horn Island that day. Whatever picture eventually emerges from this investigation won't rest on just a handful of accounts. It will be built from dozens of separate perspectives compared against each other and against whatever physical evidence, GPS data, and forensic findings continue to develop. That kind of breadth takes real time, and it's part of why a case this publicly urgent can still legitimately take weeks or months to actually resolve. The only way stories like this continue to be told is if people like you choose to care. And if you're still watching, I know you care. But caring isn't enough. Caring has to mean something. Caring has to lead to action. It's worth being precise about the grand jury step because it's been widely misunderstood throughout this case. District Attorney Angel Myers McRath has confirmed that every death in Jackson County, aside from natural deaths and non-criminal car accidents, gets presented to a grand jury as standard procedure, something her office has done throughout her entire career. That means the grand jury referral itself isn't on its own evidence that criminal charges are coming. It's simply the standard next step for any unnatural or suspicious death in that county, Nolan's case included. She's also confirmed that evidence in this case will stay out of public view until the grand jury reviews it first, a decision her office says is meant to protect the integrity of the investigation, not to withhold information out of indifference. We can't publicly discuss the evidence, the interviews, or what those efforts have uncovered while the investigation is underway, she said. Our restraint in sharing details is not a refusal to share the truth. It's our commitment to protecting the process that allows the truth to be known with confidence. It's worth noting that not every legal voice reads this referral the same way. Former Mississippi Judge Carlos Moore has publicly raised concerns about McRath's office, specifically citing a separate earlier case involving a fatal police shooting where he says overwhelming evidence still failed to produce an indictment. He's argued a grand jury referral on its own shouldn't be treated as evidence of progress. A different attorney, Tyler Bailey, has offered the more procedural explanation described above, that this referral is genuinely standard for the county regardless of what it ultimately produces. Both perspectives can be true simultaneously. This can be routine procedure, and this specific prosecutor's track record can still deserve close continued attention. These victims wait for justice. Nolan Wells is still waiting. The least we can do is make sure his story reaches as far as it deserves. Subscribe. Not for us, for him. That explanation, however procedurally sound, hasn't fully satisfied the family's frustration, and it's worth understanding why. Christine Wansley has said the last time she spoke directly with the sheriff's office was only a day or two after Nolan's body was found. She's described the family's continued public advocacy, the independent autopsy, the press conferences, the interviews, as a direct response to that silence, saying she and her husband are moving the way they are because local authorities said they believed Nolan had drowned and didn't suspect foul play within an hour of his body being recovered. That statement, delivered so quickly, is a big part of why this family has never simply accepted the official account at face value. Before going any further, it's worth being precise about a word that gets thrown around loosely in cases like this one: cover-up. That word can mean wildly different things, and the differences matter enormously, legally and morally. It could mean something relatively minor, a group of scared teenagers hiding that they'd been drinking, or embarrassed about a detail that had nothing to do with Nolan's actual death and simply not volunteering it. It could mean something more serious, deliberately deleting messages or misleading investigators about a timeline to avoid scrutiny without necessarily being connected to how Nolan actually died. Or, in the most serious version, it could mean actively concealing knowledge of how Nolan was harmed. Those are three entirely different categories of behavior, carrying three entirely different levels of culpability, and this case, as it stands right now, hasn't been shown to definitively land in any one of them. Think about what it means to have watched this entire story. You've heard Nolan's name. You know what was taken from him. You've seen his mother's pain. If you walk away now without subscribing, you're not just leaving this video. You're leaving his story to fade back into the silence it came from. That's not what you came here to do. Subscribe. Be the reason his name doesn't disappear again. This distinction matters because loose, imprecise language does real damage in a case this public. Calling every unexplained gap a cover-up without specifying which version of that word actually applies collapses genuinely different levels of wrongdoing into a single maximally alarming category. A teenager who deleted a photo because he'd been drinking underage out of simple embarrassment is not equivalent to someone who deliberately concealed evidence of how a friend died. Both could technically fall under a broad definition of covering something up. Only one of them represents anything close to the kind of serious wrongdoing this case's most alarming coverage has implied. Let's start with the simplest and statistically most common explanation for a case shaped like this: Horn. Horn Island's currents are documented repeatedly by people who know that water well as genuinely dangerous, capable of shifting from a few feet deep to 20 feet within a couple of steps. A crowded holiday beach with dozens of unfamiliar people spread out is exactly the kind of environment where a drowning can happen quickly and quietly without anyone specifically watching closely enough to notice in time. Under this version, Nolan's friends left because they genuinely believed he was staying behind by his own choice. And everything since, the missing phone, the inconsistent timeline details, reflects nothing more sinister than scared, imperfect teenagers handling a tragedy badly, not causing one. There's real credible support for this version beyond just Coffindaffer's own assessment. Drowning experts have repeatedly noted that real drownings rarely resemble the loud, visible struggles depicted in film and television. A person drowning often cannot call out or wave for help at all because the body prioritizes the basic mechanics of trying to breathe over any other voluntary movement. That means a drowning can look from even a short distance away almost unremarkable, right up until it's too late for anyone nearby to intervene. Applied to Horn Island specifically, a beach reportedly packed with dozens of strangers, none of them specifically responsible for watching any one person, that dynamic becomes considerably easier to imagine. A subscription says you won't let this happen again. The world looked away from Nolan for too long. Don't let it look away now. Every person who subscribes is a witness, and witnesses are what the dead deserve. The middle possibility is the one Coffindaffer's own hedge seems to be pointing toward. Under this version, Nolan's death is still fundamentally an accident. Nobody caused it. But something happened in the hours and days afterward. Panic, fear of getting in trouble for underage drinking, fear of public backlash. That led someone to delete messages, give an incomplete account, or hold on to a phone longer than they should have. This is functionally the same legal territory Daniel Perry's case in Texas already occupies. An accidental death sitting alongside separate real accountability for what happened after. It doesn't require anyone to have caused Nolan's death. It only requires someone to have made a bad decision once he was already gone. That comparison to Daniel Perry's case is worth taking seriously as more than just a passing analogy because it demonstrates this middle possibility isn't hypothetical or unprecedented. 2 teenagers in Texas were arrested not for causing their friend's drowning, but specifically for what they did afterward, discarding his phone, deleting messages, once they realized an investigation was coming. That case shows exactly how this middle possibility could unfold legally. An accidental drowning ruling standing alongside separate real criminal charges tied entirely to concealment after the fact. If something similar happened here, it wouldn't require revisiting the question of how Nolan actually died. It would simply require confirming whether specific deliberate actions were taken afterward to protect specific individuals from scrutiny, regardless of their innocence in the death itself. If you want to see more stories like this, stories where the truth refuses to stay buried, there's one way to make sure you don't miss the next one. It takes 2 seconds. It changes nothing about your life, but it changes everything about whether we can keep making these investigations. The most serious possibility is the one driving the most public attention, and it's also the one with the least actual evidence behind it right now. This version holds that Nolan's death wasn't purely accidental, that some kind of altercation or intervening event contributed to it, and that the friend group's account since then has been shaped specifically to obscure that. The independent autopsy's finding, an unexplained area of discoloration with cause and manner of death still undetermined, keeps this possibility technically open. But it's important to say plainly, this remains the least supported of the 3 scenarios by anything currently confirmed. No physical evidence has been shown to confirm it. No witness has directly described it happening. It survives as a possibility specifically because the case hasn't produced enough information yet to rule it out, not because anything currently points toward it directly. It's worth being fair to why this possibility has attracted as much attention as it has, even without direct confirming evidence. The independent autopsy report explicitly states the examining pathologist cannot rule out intervening non-accidental factors. language that, while carefully hedged, keeps this door open in a way an ordinary drowning ruling wouldn't. The retained neck structures, even with a plausible ordinary forensic explanation attached to them, meant the independent exam simply couldn't fully address the question of neck trauma on its own. And the broader context of this case, a young black man, a predominantly white friend group, a state with a well-documented history that this family has referenced directly, gives this possibility a weight beyond just the forensic evidence alone. None of that confirms this scenario happened. It does explain why it hasn't been dismissed either. If this case stayed with you, then you already know what you need to do next. Subscribe. Because Nolan Wells deserves to be remembered, and we can't do that without you. Here's the detail that keeps all three of these possibilities alive at once, and it's worth explaining clearly. Nolan was last confirmed seen around 3 that afternoon talking with Katie McCormack. After that point, no single verified independent witness account has been able to confirm exactly what he did next, minute by minute, before he ended up in the water. That's not necessarily suspicious on its own. Horn Island was reportedly packed that day. Dozens of people, multiple boats, a constantly shifting crowd of strangers and loose acquaintances. In an environment like that, it's entirely plausible for someone to genuinely lose track of a specific person for a stretch of time without anyone doing anything wrong at all. But it also means the single most important window in this entire case, the actual transition from being seen safely on the beach to ending up in dangerous water, currently has no confirmed independent eyewitness account attached to it. Everything else in this case, the phone, the timeline disputes, the friend group's account versus Katie's account, exists specifically because that central gap has never been filled. A crime expert speaking with News Nation raised exactly this point directly, calling it genuinely shocking that nobody in the crowd on Horn Island that day apparently saw Nolan in the water, given how many people were reportedly present. Investigators, according to that same reporting, are still combing through footage from strangers, ordinary people who happened to be on the island that day and may have unknowingly captured Nolan on camera without even realizing it at the time. That effort is directly tied to filling this exact gap, and it's part of why the sheriff's office has repeatedly publicly asked anyone who was on the island that day to come forward with any photos or videos they might have. Every subscription is a promise that we will keep digging, that we will not let these cases go cold again. And I need you to make that promise right now, because Nolan's case is still open, and it won't close until we get answers. Katie McCormack's account, delivered through her family, says Nolan told her he intended to head back and rejoin his friends. She never actually watched him do it. That's worth repeating here because it's easy to treat her account as though it closes the gap. It doesn't fully. It tells us what Nolan said he planned to do. It doesn't tell us whether he actually did it or what happened if something changed his plan in the minutes after that conversation ended. The gap between his stated intention and his actual physical location before entering the water remains open, regardless of whose account of that final conversation turns out to be more accurate. Her mother, Gracie McCormack, has been specific about this exact nuance. Katie had a conversation and assumed that Nolan was getting ready to get on the boat he came out on, she told the Daily Mail. Katie assumed the friends telling him to get on the boat wouldn't have left him. That word, assumed, appears twice in that single statement, and it's doing real work. It's the family's own careful acknowledgement that Katie's account is built on a reasonable inference from a real conversation, not a direct observation of what actually happened afterward. According to her mother, Katie was on the island with a different group of friends entirely and later left with her brother and his fiancée, further confirming that whatever happened to Nolan after that specific conversation ended, she simply wasn't present to witness it. You've come this far with us. Don't stop now. Subscribe. Be part of this investigation, because no case stays cold forever, and the next ghost might be closer than you think. The friend group's account, that Nolan chose to stay behind with Katie, has been described consistently across multiple separate interviews from Treston Shepard to Warren Hudson. That consistency is worth taking seriously, but it's also worth remembering what it does and doesn't establish. Multiple friends agreeing on the same account tells us they're describing the same shared understanding, or the same coordinated story. It doesn't by itself tell us which of those two things is actually happening. And notably, none of the friends interviewed publicly so far have described directly witnessing the specific moment Nolan made that choice, or watching him afterward in the time immediately before the boat departed without him. Ben Crump has framed this exact contradiction as the central unresolved dispute in the entire case. "She's saying he went to get on the boat," he said, referring to Katie's account. "They're saying he didn't get on the boat. Somebody must not be telling the truth." That framing, while understandable given how emotionally direct it is, arguably oversimplifies what's actually a more layered situation. It's entirely possible for Katie's account and the friend's account to both reflect honest memories of the same afternoon. If something changed in the gap between Nolan's stated intention and whatever ultimately happened, rather than requiring either side to be lying outright, "These victims wait for justice, Nolan Wells is still waiting," the least we can do is make sure his story reaches as far as it deserves. Subscribe. Not for us, for him. It's worth bringing the independent autopsy findings directly into this framework, since they intersect with all three possibilities in different ways. Dr. Roger Mitchell's report found no lacerations, no fractures, and no other deep tissue injuries anywhere on Nolan's body, aside from one area of unexplained discoloration at the back of his head. That absence of widespread injury leans against the most serious possibility. A violent altercation would typically leave more than a single ambiguous finding behind. At the same time, the report explicitly states the examining pathologist cannot rule out intervening non-accidental factors, specifically because the state had already retained certain neck structures before Mitchell's exam took place, limiting what he could independently confirm about potential neck trauma. Mitchell's own report lists specific, still unanswered questions directly: how Wells entered the water, whether he had any neck injuries, whether there was any brain bleeding, and what was found in his stomach. Every one of those questions maps directly onto one of the three possibilities discussed tonight: an accident with a straightforward physiological explanation for water entry, an accident complicated by decomposition simply obscuring an otherwise unremarkable death, or something more serious requiring exactly the kind of neck trauma the state's retained structures were meant to help clarify. A crime expert speaking with NewsNation raised something worth applying directly to this framework: the value of testing the friend group's account against the boat's actual time-stamped GPS movements. The friends gave their account of that day to family members and investigators before the GPS tracking data ever became public. This expert noted, if their story does not match completely with what that boat's own track movements show, then they're going to have a problem. That's a genuinely useful test, precisely because it doesn't depend on believing or disbelieving anyone's character. It simply compares a human account, given without knowledge of what the objective record would eventually show, against that same objective record once it existed. If this case stayed with you, if any part of this story hit the way it hit us, then you already know what you need to do next. Subscribe, because Nolan Wells deserves to be remembered, and we can't do that without you. Under the first, a clean accident, the friend's account should match the GPS data closely, since there'd be no reason for anyone to have shaded their account toward a particular narrative. Under the second, panic-driven concealment, the GPS data might reveal small, understandable inconsistencies, timing details slightly off without necessarily undermining the core account. Under the third, something more serious, larger, harder to explain discrepancies between the friend's story and the boat's actual documented movements would become the strongest evidence supporting that possibility. As of this recording, no public reporting has identified a clear, confirmed mismatch between the friend's account and the GPS data. That doesn't rule any possibility out. It simply means this particular test hasn't yet produced a clear answer publicly in either direction. So what does all of this actually mean for where this case goes from here? It means the investigation's real job right now isn't choosing between these three possibilities based on which one feels most compelling. It's closing the specific evidentiary gap that keeps all three of them alive simultaneously. That means finding any additional witnesses who were on that beach and might have seen Nolan during that window, something the sheriff's office has publicly requested repeatedly. It means completing the phone's forensic examination to determine whether anything was genuinely deliberately deleted or whether the empty account reflects something more mundane. And it means finally getting toxicology results from both the state and independent autopsies. The one piece of evidence capable of ruling out or confirming physiological factors that could explain what happened once Nolan entered the water. You stayed until the end. You heard Nolan's name. You heard his mother's pain. Now do the only thing that makes sense. Subscribe. Because he deserves to be remembered. And we can't do that without you. Until those specific things happen, this case is going to keep sitting exactly where Coffindaffer's own statement leaves it. A reasonable lean toward an accident sitting next to a real professional's instinct that the public record isn't yet complete. It's worth adding, too, that institutional pressure on this investigation has continued building, separate from any of the three possibilities themselves. The NAACP has formally passed a resolution calling on local, state, and federal authorities, including the Department of Justice, to conduct a complete, transparent review of what happened to Nolan. The reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction has grown to $125,000, funded jointly by Reverend A.I. Sharpton, Tyler Perry, and former NFL player Terrell Owens. None of that pressure on its own moves this case toward any one of the three possibilities discussed tonight, but it does mean whatever evidence eventually resolves this case will do so under an unusually intense degree of national scrutiny, a level of attention most cases involving a single contested death never receive. I think it's worth closing on something that applies to every one of these three possibilities equally. None of them requires assuming the worst about any specific named individual who hasn't been charged with anything. None of them requires dismissing Nolan's family's very real, legitimate frustration with how slowly answers have come. And none of them currently is confirmed. The world looked away from Nolan for too long. Don't look away now. Subscribe. Be a witness. Because witnesses are what the dead deserve. What Coffindaffer's assessment actually models, better than most coverage of this case has managed, is the discipline of holding a genuine lean toward one explanation while staying honest about how much is still unknown. That's a harder position to sit in than picking a side and defending it. It's also, right now, the most accurate one available. Nolan Wells was 18. Weeks after his death, the honest answer to what happened to him during that specific, still unaccounted for window remains exactly that, honestly unknown. Whichever of these three possibilities it eventually turns out to be, there's a broader lesson worth carrying forward from this entire episode, one that extends beyond just this specific case. When a tragedy this public produces this much uncertainty, the instinct, understandably, is to pick a side, an accident or a cover-up, and defend it with whatever evidence seems to fit. But genuine uncertainty doesn't resolve itself just because picking a side feels more emotionally satisfying than sitting with ambiguity. The actual work of resolving a case like this one happens slowly, through witness interviews, forensic examination, and the patient accumulation of verified fact, not through confident declarations made before that work is finished. Coffindaffer's own statement, "An accident probably, but I don't fully trust we have the whole story," is uncomfortable precisely because it refuses that easier, more satisfying resolution. It's also, as of tonight, the most honest place this case can actually stand. You stayed until the end. You heard his name. You heard his mother's pain. Now do the only thing that makes sense. Subscribe. Because Nolan Wells deserves to be remembered, and we can't do that without you. We're going to stay on this story as toxicology results finally arrive. As the phone inspection moves forward, and as this case continues toward a grand jury, we'll bring you the facts as we actually get them verified, and not a moment before. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He was a son, a brother, a teammate, a young man who loved his family and wanted to take care of them. He went to Horn Island for one last summer outing, and he never came home. Now his family is left with nothing but questions, questions that deserve answers, questions that deserve the truth. And the only way that truth comes out is if people like you refuse to look away, refuse to let this story fade, refuse to let the system decide that Nolan's life didn't matter enough to investigate fully. That's what subscribing means. It's not a favor to us. It's a promise that you will keep watching, that you will keep caring, that you will keep demanding answers until justice is done. So I'm asking you, not for me, not for this channel, for Nolan, for his mother, Christine, for every family that's still waiting for answers, for every young person who never got to tell their own story. Subscribe, because no case stays cold forever. And the next ghost might be closer than you think. We'll see you in the next one.